Hello and welcome to Retro Reviews, my channel where I review my favorite retro video games of all time, as well as some modern releases I have recently finished. Today I want to talk about a retro game that's still technically retro. It's going to be From Software's Dark Souls 2. Now I'll be covering the Scholar of the First Sin edition because that's what I recently played through. I've been going through the entire From Software pantheon of the Soulsborne games, and I finally got around to Dark Souls 2 and 3. Those are my last holdouts there, and the DLC for Bloodborne. So I thought I'd go through and review the entire From Software catalog for the Soulsborne games specifically. I haven't played any of the Armored Core games, but I'll be covering the ones that are most popular in the Soulsborne series. And Dark Souls 2 was kind of an enigma when it came out. It was this weird thing because it was a direct sequel to an incredibly popular game in Dark Souls, incredibly more mainstream. It's finally getting the recognition it deserves, this game style. And Dark Souls 2 was put out as a direct sequel. At the same time, it has almost nothing to do with the original game. And part of the reason is because the director of Dark Souls and Demon Souls actually was working on Bloodborne at the time, and they put together Dark Souls 2 with essentially From Software's B team, while Miyazaki was working on Bloodborne. There were some interviews and things saying Miyazaki was kind of sad that he wasn't able to work on Dark Souls 2, and you can definitely see that it wasn't made by the same team. Now that's a lot of reason for people to say that you should actually just skip Dark Souls 2, go straight from Dark Souls 1 to 3. Most people will say that playing just the Miyazaki games is really what you should be doing. But I actually really enjoyed Dark Souls 2 in a lot of ways. There's a lot to dislike about this game, but there's also a lot to really enjoy. And I want to go over both of those things and tell you why I actually enjoyed Dark Souls 2 and why there is a fun game to be had here. So first off, let's start off with some of the criticisms. You can tell right off the gate that this is going to be a different experience from Dark Souls 1. From the first enemy that you encounter, hit stun feels different. It feels like when you hit things, it doesn't like hit into them the same way. It almost feels artificial or like it's not quite connecting somehow, but you can hear a cue. It doesn't sound like a good solid hit, but you can tell that you hit them. They get weird knockback, you get weird knockback. Sometimes you get hit by things and don't get any hit stun, but you can see your life bar go down. It looks like something definitely should have missed you, but you get hit. So there's some weird hit boxes and hurt boxes to worry about. It doesn't feel like everything connects super well. You can tell that this is not the same type of experience that you got in Dark Souls 1 right off the gate. Now, from what I understand, the original Dark Souls 2 on the PlayStation 3 was a much different experience from Scholar of the First Sin. And I never experienced the original. I only got the Scholar of the First Sin edition, which I understand improved a lot of things. I'm not sure all of the things that it improved, but it is a more sound experience with all the DLC included, of course. So that's the experience that I had. But I can tell that they didn't fully flesh out the polishing on the Scholar of the First Sin edition either, because it still feels a little clunky for the most part. I think enemy designs for the most part are actually pretty good. Some of them are weird. The very first major enemy that you come across that is a recurring one, it's kind of like a sub-boss, is this big, fat, green troll thing, and it's really annoying. It has giant hitboxes. It's hard to avoid. I was determined to kill it the first time, and I did, but it took me quite a few tries. And this is coming from someone who had played most of the other Souls games, including Elden Ring up to this point. So I was determined that Dark Souls 2 wouldn't kick my butt. But this game is probably second or third hardest in the entire series. And that's kind of crazy to me because I'd played so many of the other games. But man, Dark Souls 2 is a difficult game. And for the most part, it's not difficult because it's a good challenge. It's difficult because of the wonky hitboxes and hurtboxes. And that's the biggest shame I feel like most people have with this game. It's difficult, but not for the right reasons. It doesn't feel like a true Dark Souls game because it's just too wonky. But let's get into what makes Dark Souls 2 a good game. In fact, a great game in a lot of ways. It has some great boss designs. In fact, it has a ton of bosses in this game. You have one that pursues you throughout the entirety of the game, at various moments throughout the game, where you'll encounter it multiple times. You can defeat it, and it'll come back again later. And you have to find the eventual spot where you can encounter him for the final time and actually beat him and take him out. It's a really great mechanic. I had heard about this boss and how omnipresent he was, kind of terrifying when he'd just pop up out of nowhere. I think it was RNG dependent in a lot of places where he'd just pop up. You could be fighting enemies and all of a sudden you're like, oh no, I've got to fight this boss now. I actually never died to him. I think I was ready for him, and so I wasn't as concerned. I made some good moves. I never died to that boss, but he was a terrifying presence. He was scary to fight. I was really close to death a few times. When I actually encountered him for the final time, I actually missed the boss encounter, so I did most of the game before I went back and finally killed him, which I thought was pretty funny. So he was much easier when I finally killed him. But the first few encounters I had with him were pretty scary, and I like the idea behind it. And that's what I like about most of the bosses. They are really well executed for the most part. Again, you have to deal with the wonky combat a little bit, but the bosses' designs are actually really well done. I have to credit the team at From Software that made this game, because they made some incredibly interesting bosses. Some of the most memorable bosses in the entire Souls series. I've seen a lot of videos on the top bosses in the Souls series, and a lot of these lists will include some of these really difficult bosses from Dark Souls 2. That's a testament to how well they actually designed that. Where there's not as much polish on some of the mechanics, the bosses are really well done. And some of the areas are also really fun to explore and to encounter. Some of them are absolutely not. I encountered a few areas that I absolutely hated. There's one with these knights that come after you, and it seems like an endless wave of them. Some of them shoot arrows that do like a quarter of your health, even if you're highly leveled and have great armor and everything. That area sucks, and I hate it. I think most people hate it because it's a slog to get through to get to the boss area. It's just not very fun. What they introduced in this game I thought was actually a pretty good mechanic, because it's so difficult and not very fair at times. After I think 15 encounters with an enemy, they will no longer spawn. So if you get too frustrated with an area and you just are pounding your head against the wall over and over and over again, and you keep encountering these enemies, you can finally despawn them. I think you have to kill them 15 times. It might be kill them. I think the original idea was to prevent souls farming, so you couldn't just level up your character a billion times. But honestly, a couple of the areas, it was a great boon, because I didn't have to worry about that stupid enemy that kept jank killing me over and over and over again. So that's where some of the frustration lies. But getting to those bosses and actually fighting the bosses was a great time. The boss runs sucked, but the bosses were fantastic. That's the sentiment I mostly see from people. Now, this game I also probably spent the most time on. I think in 2023, it was my second most played game. I think behind Returnal. So I put 40-something hours into this game because there's a lot of content. A lot of really good content, in fact. There's some fun stuff to be had in this game, and it's mostly from the bosses and the huge boss variety. There's tons of bosses, there's tons of hidden content, there's just tons to explore in this game, and a lot of it is very much worth finding. Now, I will say from the get-go, if you're starting up Dark Souls 2, I would recommend you actually play this one. If you've played the whole Souls series and you haven't played Dark Souls 2, I recommend you go and try it out. But from the very beginning, you should be using a guide. Here's why. One of the main stats in Dark Souls 2 is adaptability, which is a stat that you only find in this game, and it's really weird. If you don't level it up early on, you are going to have a miserable time with this game. Fortunately for me, I played with a guide from the beginning because I was aware of some of these issues that Dark Souls 2 had. And because I was aware of that, I had a much more streamlined and fun experience. Adaptability increases your invulnerability frames on your roll, which is incredibly important. Instead of having just like a base invincibility frame like every other Souls game, you have to level it up. So early on, you might get hit by a bunch of bullcrap that you swear you dodged perfectly. But no matter how quickly or tightly you press this dodge button, you're not going to have enough iframes to dodge some of the lingering hitboxes that some of these enemies have, or some of the bosses have. You're going to have to tank things on your shield until you have enough stuff to level up your adaptability. So if you're playing Dark Souls 2 for the first time, make sure you level up that quite a bit. If you look at some guides, they'll tell you how much to level it up before leveling other things up. But adaptability is one of the most important things in this game. One of the other things that I actually love about this game is the hub world. In fact, most people will say in the Dark Souls world, Majula is the best hub world in the entire series. And that is saying something. You've got stuff like Firelink Shrine in Dark Souls, the Nexus in Demon Souls, and people are saying that Majula is the best one. It's beautiful. It's gorgeous. It feels like this place of respite. It's actually fantastic. the branching paths that come off of it, there's tons of different ways to go, different areas to explore. It is a really wonderful hub world. I will say that you need a guide for even from the beginning, because it is really difficult to find out where you're going in this game. Whereas in Dark Souls 1, if you wandered off into the area with the skeletons and got your butt kicked over and over again, you might figure out, this is not the area for me. But in Dark Souls 2, you could explore 4 or 5 different paths and not have a clue which one is the intended route for your level or for the early game. It's really annoying. So I would say from the very get-go, play with a guide. You will have a more streamlined and more exciting experience if you do this. I think you'll have a very frustrating experience and you'll probably want to quit if you don't play with a guide. And because this game is so big, if you're just experimenting and looking around, you might waste a ton of time figuring out the game where you could just be playing it instead. Because it is probably one of the biggest ones outside of something like Elden Ring, where you're going to sink a ton of time into it. You definitely should be streamlining your experience. So I would say Dark Souls 2 is a great game trapped in a kind of mediocre shell, unfortunately. There's a lot of jank, there's a lot of poor hitboxes and hurtboxes to worry about in this game, but there's a great game underneath it. If you're willing to put up with a few things and get over the learning curve, you'll actually have a great time with Dark Souls 2 because the boss fights are actually so rewarding. I love all of the boss fights that I can think of right now. The major boss fights are really exciting and interesting. I think there may be 1 or 2 here and there that I didn't love, but for the most part, they're fantastic. So I would say push through and play Dark Souls 2 if you're a fan of the Souls series in general. I think I'm going to give Dark Souls 2 Scholar of the First Sin a silver rank. It's close to a gold rank, but like I said, this mediocre shell is trapping it and keeping it down. The jank and bugs and stuff are not necessarily worth it. So if you're not a Souls series veteran, I would say stray away from this one, play the other games first, and then come back to this one later. Thank you so much, and I'll see you on the next one.